Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, I'm here with Professor Philippe Lagassé from Carleton University. There's been a lot of talk, particularly in Quebec, about the oath to the king, because we have a bunch of new MNAs who don't want to swear it. And the objections they're raising, I think, are perhaps a little bit specious because they are talking about swearing to the King of England, which is not what they're swearing to. The English crown hasn't existed since 1707, and the King of the UK is not the King of Canada. And also this notion about him being the supreme head of the Church of England, which also doesn't really apply to the King of England, but sorry, the King of Canada. But I figured I'd get Philippe Lagassé to explain to us why this is. So, Phil.
Well, thanks, Dale. I think just to start off, it's important to kind of break apart a little bit where the sovereignist and the Quebec City view is coming from, and
Okay.
why it's complicated a little bit by our Canadian practice, which dates from 1953 in terms of the royal styles and titles that we have.
Okay.
So, as you mentioned, the King of England doesn't exist as a thing
Yeah.
and hasn't existed since the Act of Union. So we kind of accept that and we take it as a given, which is, I mean, the reality is people still use that term and it's common and people know what you're talking about when you use it. And that it has particular resonance in Quebec simply because the English fact, it's a useful kind of rhetorical tool to use that terminology.
Okay.
Uh, but the idea of kind of a separate Canadian crown is one that works conceptually and does make sense. And I think if you were to probe most Quebec constitutional lawyers, they wouldn't have any difficulty accepting and recognizing that.
Hmm.
Where it gets a little bit complicated is the Canadian Royal Styles and Titles, which still maintains that it's the King of the United Kingdom, Canada, Defender of the Faith, and things like that. So you can say, on the one hand, yes, it's the King of Canada, but we still kind of keep that connection, right, to the
Yeah.
UK. There's this understanding that we're even acknowledging that this person is the defender of the faith, even though it doesn't really apply in Canada, and yet we still kind of refer to it in our royal styles and titles. Now that's not in the oath itself,
Hmm.
but it's still important to recognize that it's not that they don't have a case; they're just focusing on one particular aspect of it, right?
Okay. Um, right. And I think part of what I try and put the wedge into is the oath is to the King of Canada kind of as an office and not to Charles III as a person. And I think that's kind of where I can differentiate between Charles III being the supreme head of the Church of England, but the King of Canada as an office is not.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I think I would agree with you, right, that it
Okay.
is an oath to the office of the sovereign of Canada. And part of the difficulty, though, is let's take a look at some of the rulings around the citizenship oath,
Right.
where you'll have some judges, particularly, and these are federal and Ontario judges, telling us, so Edward Morgan, for instance, when in the latest case, he makes a very eloquent kind of explanation of what the crown is in Canada and how it operates and so on and so forth. And yet, when it comes to the Court of Appeal in McKeeter, I believe it is, you get a slightly different take on this because they say, well, it's not actually an oath to the sovereign; it's an oath to our system of government. It's an oath to kind of our state, our democracy, as it were. And that just kind of muddies the waters a bit, right? For
Hmm.
for this argument that the PQ and QS would-be MNAs are arguing for. They're saying, well, why can't we just, swear it to the people of Quebec or some other alternative? And it is difficult when you're dealing with the citizenship oath rulings where judges federally in Ontario have told us that it's really a symbolic oath, right, to
Hmm.
something else. And so you might, understandably, if you're these people resisting the oath, say, well, if it's a symbolic oath for the citizens, surely it is for us too. Why can't we just replace it? And we've put ourselves in a bit of a bind here, right? In trying to get around this and trying to avoid some of these conversations, because a lot of these glosses that we put on our system end up creating a great deal of confusion about what it is that we're doing. Just the last point I'll make, when you look at the history of English law, interesting. It was found that the oath is actually to the natural person, which makes it even more complicated. So, is that our view now, or is it an oath to the office, or is it an oath to what the office represents? I mean, there's so many different interpretations that I think we would benefit from a little bit of clarity here as to what we're asking people to do.
Okay. One of the things that you are particularly evangelical about is the notion of the corporation soul as the crown, and how the oath plays into that in terms of what heirs and what successors means as part of that oath. And I wonder if you can just kind of explain what that means in terms of the notion of the crown as this corporation soul.
Right. Well, first off, it helps us understand, to your earlier point, that we're not swearing an oath to the sovereign of the United Kingdom. Right. We're swearing it to a separate legal entity, and that happens to be in a personal union. Right. So you have the King of Canada and the King of the United Kingdom, and those are two separate, distinct legal personalities and offices, but they happen to be held by the same natural person, the same person. Right. We're in a person union. But that helps clarify a little bit what the nature of the oath is today, right, in a Canadian context. And here again, referring back to the citizenship oath rulings that we've had, there too, the judges make this point that it's, and Edward Morgan in particular, is very clear that you're not swearing an oath to some foreign monarch. You're swearing an oath to the head of the apex of the Canadian state.
Yeah.
Right. So that helps explain that. The other piece, heirs and successors, is also an interesting one, right? Because, and this is just my view on it, successors refers to those that will occupy the office in a legal sense, right? And heirs refers to more the natural person's successor, heirs, right? So in the sense of, their extended descendants, as it were. But here again, even the courts and citizenship oath rulings have told us this is a reference to the continuity of government. When, on plain reading, you start getting a little frustrated with this, because you say, well, why can't we just admit what it is that we're doing? And if we could have a clear, conversation about this, we'd have a more fulsome debate.
Yeah, and I think the continuity aspect is what's important, particularly for those of us who are right now living in a time of transition between Elizabeth II and Charles III. And how that oath extends to both of them, because, or those of us who have sworn an oath previously, because it extends to both of them because of the continuity aspect.
Right. So that's the other kind of key point is the fact is, once you've sworn the oath to the sovereign, it doesn't matter who happens to hold the office as a natural person. It's the same legal person that you've sworn to, which is part of the reason why we don't need to re-swear oaths. Some people may choose to, but there's no, even if there were no laws indicating that you didn't need to do it again, we know at common law that there would be no need.
Right. And I think just the final point on this is there, around the heirs and successors portion, there's been some stories in the media where people are saying, well, you're swearing an oath to the royal family. It's like, well, no, because we're not swearing an oath to, for example, Prince Andrew. Heirs and successors is pretty much just the direct line of succession. It's not anyone kind of outside of that.
Yeah, I think that's where this piece. Why do we have both? Why do we have heirs and successors? I think the idea being that successors is clearly established by law, whereas heirs being established by, just basic biology.
Right. All right. And I guess the question then becomes, how does one amend this oath if one were so desirous to do so?
Okay, so I think there's a number of things to discuss here because there's been a number of views that have been put out in the media. The first one would be that parliamentary privilege would allow you or would allow the Quebec National Assembly to admit the members and have them sit regardless of the oath. Now, we know that doesn't work because parliamentary privilege exists on par, right, with the oath in the Constitution Act 1867. So you can't use one part of the Constitution to invalidate another part. So
Right.
parliamentary privilege wouldn't work. There's been some talk that somehow you could establish a constitutional convention such that you would let the members sit, and then over time it would just become the reality. Except the problem is constitutional convention doesn't work contrary to law; it modifies. Right. So you can't use constitutional convention to do something that's unconstitutional, like in the sense of the letter of the Constitution.
Right.
And then that brings us to the lively debate and I think this is where it's interesting. Which amending formula would you use? Now, I think my friend and colleague Emmett McFarlane and others have made the case that it can't be the unilateral formula because this is Section 128 applies to both the federal houses and to the provincial legislatures. Therefore, it kind of encapsulates everybody, and it's part of the Constitution of Canada. It's not part of the Constitution of Quebec per se.
Right.
So that suggests either the general amending formula or the 43 formula, which is the bilateral, which would allow Quebec and the federal parliament to arrive at some agreement here. Now, I personally think that the alternative would be Section 45, the unilateral amending formula by Quebec. And the reason I think this is not because I think that it accords with the letter of the Constitution or the amending formula, but if the changes that were made to the Constitution of Canada through the Charter of the French language, right, which also used that formula, if the federal government does not contest this, and it does go through, then this sets an important precedent in terms of how we interpret that amending formula.
Okay.
And I would encourage viewers to take a look at a very good article written by Benoit Pelletier in The Devoir explaining this, and you can agree or disagree with his interpretation. But the basic idea being, are we headed towards a point where Section 45 amendments can be done provided that they deal only with the internal affairs of a province, which is his contention. If it doesn't deal with federalism, if it doesn't deal with other provinces, if it deals squarely with the affairs of the internal affairs effectively of the province, does that open that possibility? So I fully, and I guess my final point here is I'm sympathetic to that view simply because not because of the letter of the Constitution, but because I think that's where our constitutional politics are headed.
Okay, that's very interesting, and I would also just point viewers to a piece that Emmett McFarlane wrote about this as well on his new Substack. So I will try and put some links in the description below, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Thanks, Dale. Take care.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.